Hey all, in this video we're going to go over market disequilibrium. Alright, so market disequilibrium. And so before we actually get into what market disequilibrium is, let's do a quick review of just supply and demand. And so here, if we're going to draw out our graph, remember our y-axis is going to be price, our x-axis is quantity. We have a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. And then where supply meets demand is going to be our equilibrium quantity and our equilibrium price. And so depending on whether our demand or our supply curve shifts, increases or decreases, that is going to change, right? That is going to change our price and quantity here. So for example, let's say our demand curve increases. Well, if our demand curve increases, right, it's going to shift to the right. And so let's draw an arrow to indicate that it shifted to the right here. Well, what happens to our price and quantity? Well, if our demand curve shifts to the right, we have a new equilibrium as marked in red. And so at this new equilibrium, this is our new equilibrium quantity, and this is our new equilibrium price. So what happened to our price and quantity here? Well, we know that our price increased and that our quantity also increased here. So we're going to say when our demand curve shifts to the right, both price and quantity increase. Well, what about supply, right? Let's draw it on this side. Price, quantity, supply, demand, and then equilibrium, right? So let's say that our price increases, and let's do this in purple. So if our supply increases, sorry. So if our supply increases, right, it shifts to the right. And let's draw an arrow to indicate that shift to the right. Well, we have a new equilibrium, right? It's where the new supply curve meets the original demand curve. So right here in purple. So at this new equilibrium, this is our new equilibrium quantity, and this is our new equilibrium price. So when our supply increased, or when our supply shifts to the right, what happened to our price? Well, our price decreased, right? It went from this original price to this new price below it. So our price actually decreased. Well, what happened to our quantity? Our quantity increased, however, right? Because this is our original quantity equilibrium. And then right next to it, to the right, is our new quantity here, right? So when our demand curve shifts, our price and quantity, and also when our supply curve shifts, our price and quantity should change. But we're only looking at it through the lens of one curve shifting at a time. And so with market disequilibrium, we get into something called a double shift. Basically, all a double shift is what happens when both supply and demand shift at the same exact time. Well, here, if both curves shift at the same exact time, either price or quantity will be indeterminate. And just another word for indeterminate is in parentheses right now. It's ambiguous. We don't know what's going to happen. All right, and so of course we can draw it out and show if both supply and demand increase, right? We know that our quantity is going to increase and then our price is going to be ambiguous. We can draw it out on our graph and show it. However, in my mind, an easier way is this chart right here. So we have our price and quantity, right? Those are the only two things that can change. And there's only 4 different ways that our graph, our supply and demand graph can change, right? We can have our demand increase, we can have our demand decrease, supply increase, and supply decrease. These are our only 4 possible options here. Well, if our demand increases, our price is going to increase and our quantity is going to increase as shown on our graph on the last slide. Well, then if our demand decreases, our price and quantity is also going to decrease. Remember, the reason why both price and quantity falls or both price and quantity increases is because our law of demand. There is a positive or a direct relationship between price and quantity demanded. And so for our supply, if our supply increases, right, our price is going to decrease and our quantity is going to increase, and the opposite is true, right? If our supply decreases, our price is going to increase and our quantity is going to decrease here, right? So what happens, right? What happens if there's a double shift, right? Because this chart right here, right? This chart tells us what happens when a singular demand curve or a singular supply curve shifts, right? And so what happens if both demand and supply shift at the same time? So let's say what happens to price and quantity if our demand increases and our supply increases? Well, what's going to happen to our price and what's going to happen to our quantity? Well, if we just look at our chart, when our demand increases, both price and quantity increase. When our supply increases, our price decreases and our quantity increases here. And so if we look at this, right, we know when both demand and supply increase, our quantity arrows are moving in the same direction. They're both upward. So we know when both demand and supply increase, our quantity is going to increase. Well, if we look at our price, right, well, when demand increases, our price increases. When supply increases, our price actually decreases there. And so because the arrows are moving in opposite directions, we are going to say that our price is indeterminate. So when both demand and supply increases, our price is indeterminate and our quantity increases. Let's do one more example. All right, so let's say what happens when our demand increases and our supply decreases here. All right, so pause the video, try to do it by yourself. What happens here to our price and quantity here? All right, so here, right, we know when our demand increases, our price is going to increase and our quantity is going to increase. We know when our supply decreases, our price increases and our quantity decreases here. And so if you notice, right, when demand increases and supply decreases, our price moves in the same direction. Our price increases. And so we can say with certainty, our price is going to increase. But if you look at our quantity here, right, they are moving. Why is that? They're moving in opposite directions. So when demand increases, our quantity increases. But when our supply decreases, right, our quantity decreases. And so because the arrows are moving in opposite directions, right, we are going to say our quantity is indeterminate. So when demand increases and supply decreases here, our price increases and our quantity is indeterminate here. All right, so that's all I have for you guys today. There's going to be a separate video for the practice AP questions at the end of this Google slide, right? So if you have any questions on the practice AP questions, just look for the separate video. I hope you guys learned a lot, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.